like to talk this morning about God's sure foundation and how it relates to what we're seeing today in the world and in our country. I think for many years, America and Western Christianity have both consoled themselves into thinking that God has granted a special exclusion to us simply because we are His favorites. However, that was not the truth that Paul taught about God's single foundation. Here is the only foundation that's ever been laid. 1 Corinthians 3, and we're beginning to read in verse 9. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, and I want you to listen to this. You are God's building. Now, if we are God's building, God doesn't build on the sand. So if we are God's building, then that means, that insinuates or infers, or we infer from it, that there must be a foundation. And then Paul begins to speak about that foundation in verse 10. According to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. And we're going to look at a verse in Isaiah that kind of supplements that. But notice here in verse 11, Paul is letting us know that God doesn't have a set of rules for one group of people and another set of rules for another group of people. I know after teaching for 31 years, occasionally a student would come into my room that felt like they should be treated differently than everyone else. Sometimes the parents caused them to feel that way, that they were special, and they were so special that I should have a different set of rules for them, or a different set of expectations for them than I had for everyone else. And you know, if we're not careful, we do that to God. We feel like that we're teacher's pet, and we feel like that God should let us by with things that maybe He holds other people in account for. And Paul said that's not the way it is. For no other foundation can anyone lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. There's only one set of rules. There's only one foundation to build on. Now, with the foundation comes the guarantee of quality control. We have quality control in our world today. We have OSHA, to the bane of many. You know, we have government regulatory agencies that inspect what is done, what is made in our industry and on the job site. Maybe sometimes we feel like that it's overkill, but yet it's still good to have quality control, and God has quality control. Why? Why does God reserve the right for quality control? Because He was the one that laid the foundation. And even though Paul said that he laid the foundation, yet we'll see that it was actually God who began the work. With the foundation comes the guarantee of quality control. Now we can call that the test, and I think that's what's happening today in our society. We are being tested. I don't think there's any doubt about that. When we see what's happening in other parts of the world, and it's now come to our doorstep, we're being tested based on God's ancient guidelines and laws. How have we measured up, I wonder? You answer that in your own mind. Do you feel like, honestly, that we've done a good job obeying God's law? When He says, thou shalt not commit murder, do you feel like in the last 50 years that we've done a good job obeying that law? That the 60 million little babies that we've butchered since 1973, have we really done a good job obeying God's law? When God forbids perversion, when he forbids abomination, the things that he has commanded about a husband and wife, and there being no other allowance other than one man and one woman, representing his divine image, the mysterious image of the El Shaddai. The first glimpse of God in the home for children is mom and dad, you know. And have we done a good job here in the last few years of abiding by what God says about the establishment of family and human relationship? I would like for you to remember, I'd like for you to go back with me before December. Go back with me to November and September and August and July of last fall. What were we talking about then? What were we amazed at? Well, I think that we were talking about the 120 different genders that there are, supposedly are, in comparison to the way God made us in the beginning. So have we? Have we done a good job building on God's foundation? Well, that's what he's checking today. He's come by. Quality control, God's OSHA. He has come by to check and see how well we're building on his foundation. Verse 12. Now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, those are all commendable. Those all speak to building on the foundation in a good, godly manner. But then he also says wood, hay, or stubble, or straw. So we realize that there's a whole spectrum there. We have the possibility for either building well on God's foundation or building not very well, in a poor manner, on God's foundation. Verse 13 says, regardless of how we build, whether we've built with silver, precious stones, gold, or whether we've built with wood, hay, or stubble, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. Did you see that word there? The fire will test our work to see how we've built on the foundation. I know my uncle used to work for Keystone, and he spent many years there, and he became a metallurgist. And a metallurgist's job was in any batch of steel that they would take out a sample, and they would see, quality control would see if it was good steel, if it would stand the weight, you know, if it would endure. So God says the day will declare the way you've built on my foundation. If anyone's work which he is built on, let me read that again. If anyone's work which he is built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as though by fire. And we could talk about that. I'm not going to address that right now. What I want you to see here is that God reserves the right to test the construction on his foundation. Paul might have laid the foundation in his day, but God placed the very first stone in order to set the corner and square the construction. No other way to the Father except through God's Son, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was that first stone that was ever laid when the foundation began. In Isaiah 28:16 through 19, God says through the prophet, "Therefore thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I lay in Zion a stone for a foundation." Yes, Paul and the other apostles, they were going to build on God's foundation. They were going to construct that foundation, but the very first stone that was laid was Jesus Christ. He was a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. I'm reminded here of, as a kid, helping my dad build on to our old barn. He was building a loafing shed or an addition to the old barn, and the very first thing Dad did was set the corner. The very first thing he did was establish a corner, and from that corner the rest of the foundation was laid. And so this is what God has done through giving us Jesus Christ, His Son. He set the foundation square by way of Jesus. Whosoever believes will not act hastily. Also, I will make justice the measuring line and righteousness the plummet. What's he saying there? He set the stone to establish the foundation, and then he says, I'm going to come back and I'm going to measure the building that is constructed on it. He said, I'm going to use justice for a measuring line. I'm going to use righteousness for a plummet. Now, how do we determine justice and how do we determine righteousness? It's determined according to the laws and the commandments that God has given us. Now, human relativism, we have in the last, again, probably 50 years, we've said everything is relative. Right is based on what we think now in this moment. So what's right today might not be right tomorrow. That's a slippery slope. But God says, I'm going to establish justice for a measuring line. I'm going to establish righteousness for a plummet. I'm going to use my ageless, timeless commandments, and I'm going to measure the way you build on the foundation that I've laid through Jesus Christ. If our construction hangs over the edge of the foundation, then God says He's going to tear it down. This is what He told Israel. As we continue to read in verse 17, He says, the hail will sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water will overflow the hiding place. In other words, God says, anything that sticks over the foundation, anything that's not square, He said, I'm going to tear it down, and we're going to start over. Israel in verse 15, they felt like they were special. They felt like that they had been given an exclusion. And so in verse 15, if we go back to verse 15 and read, we'd see that Israel thought they could bargain with death to be spared. They thought they could bend and twist God's commandments and get away with murder, that they could get away with breaking God's law. And God said, no, I am sorry, your scheme will not work. Look at verse 18. Your covenant with death will be annulled, and your agreement with Sheol will not stand. He said, you think you're going to get by without obeying my law. You think you're going to get by with breaking my commandments, but you're not going to. He said, when the overflowing scourge passes through, then you will be trampled down by it. As often as it goes out, it will take you. For morning by morning, it will pass over. Now listen to this. And by day and by night, it will be a terror just to understand the report. Now that ought to hit home. That's something that we should be able to identify with. God's talking here about the daily news. God said to Israel, when I come by to test you, when I come by to measure the building that you have placed on my foundation, He said, if anything is not square, if anything's not plumb, if anything is hanging over the edge, He said, I'm going to tear it down. I'm going to sweep it away. And by day and by night, it will be a terror just to understand the report. Well, in this present day, as we watch our news, we understand what that means. We see how God has passed through Italy. The home of the Universal Church. And we see what God's done in Italy. We see what God has done in Spain. Now then we see what's happening in America. God said, and by day and by night it will be a terror just to understand the report. Although many have tried to escape divine authority, yet in the end, God will be everyone's judge. No matter what, God is still the master of the foundation and everything that's built on it. Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 19, Paul said this, "Nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands." No matter what happens to the building, no matter what happens from the plates and the sills on up, one thing is going to remain, and that's God's foundation. That's God's righteous expectation. That's God's commandments. Those will always remain. God also says here, or Paul says to Timothy, "Nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands, having this seal." There is actually an inscription stamped on God's foundation. And here are the words that are stamped on God's foundation. "The Lord knows those who are His." The Lord knows those who are His. Do you belong to God today? Are you building correctly on God's foundation? God knows it. God knows it probably better than you know it. The Lord knows those who are His. History teaches us, as we look back, history teaches us that many times God has already measured the building by way of His foundation. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through 9, it says, "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment." So, in the very beginning, God had to check the angels. God had to judge the angels because the angels were trying to play fast and loose. The angels were trying to... why? Because they probably thought they were special. They probably thought that they had a special exclusion because they were the angels, that they could get by with it and God would understand, but they didn't. It said that He cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. Verse 5, "He did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly." So, early in creation, way back in the book of Genesis, God had to check our ancestors. He had to measure the building that was being constructed on His foundation. And the Bible tells us here that of all of the antediluvian world, all of the people that lived before the flood, only 8 were spared. Can you imagine that? We see the death toll in Italy. We see the death toll in Spain. We see the death toll, the rising death toll in America. But if we could go back to the time of the flood, we would see that there were only 8 that were spared. After God came by to test the building, there were only 8 that remained. It says in verse 6, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly." God gave us Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, as an example of what happens to people that think they're special. What happens to people that think they're excluded from obeying God's righteous commandments. And America's no different. And this world is no different. We either build right on God's foundation, or He comes by and He sweeps it away. Verse 7, "And He delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelleth among them, tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds." We talked about what we were seeing before Corona broke out, before December. Remember what we were discussing? Remember what was plaguing us? We were talking about girls' sports and how the young ladies were having to put up with the transgenders that were absolutely destroying their sports. We were talking about the drag queen story hour for children in public libraries. These were the things we were discussing only a short time ago. Now then, our attention is focused on Corona. Why? Because God has come by to check His building. God has come by to check the construction that we're making on His foundation. Verse 9, then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations, and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. One thing is certain: the foundation of God stands sure, and He knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation. Now, I will make no false promise to you. I will only say those things that I know to be true. I cannot give you any assurance whether I'll live through this or not. I can't make a false promise to you that you'll live through it or not. But I will tell you that God knows how to deliver us out of temptation. It might either be by the sky and Jesus is coming, or it might be through the grave. But God knows how to deliver His own out of temptation. We might not like the way God delivers us. It might not be at the top of our list, but He knows how to deliver His own out of temptation. God bless you today.